There is a particular kind of silence that falls over a room when someone finally stops screaming. Not peaceful, not restful. The kind of silence that feels like a subtraction, like something necessary has been removed. And this is where our story begins. In the 1930s, America was drowning in an ailment it could not name. Asylums were overflowing. Patients were violent, catatonic, inconsolable. Families were desperate. Doctors were ashamed. There was a sickness in the mind that no medicine could touch, and society was willing to try almost anything to make it stop. Almost anything. Then, almost unnoticed, a Portuguese neurologist named Antonio Egas Moniz performed an experiment. He made an incision at the top of the skull. He found the prefrontal cortex, that small, ancient part of the brain where suffering lives, and he severed it. The patient survived. The screaming stopped. The doctors called it a cure. What they had actually done was simpler. They had chosen peace over complexity. They had chosen quiet over humanity. Within 10 years, tens of thousands of people were being lobotomized in America. In asylums from New York to California, in suburban hospitals and private clinics, the procedure became routine. A solution, a final answer. The medical establishment embraced it. Surgeons performed it with the certainty of men who had discovered something true. Families consented to it with the desperation of those who had exhausted every other option. And the institutions, those great warehouses of the inconvenient and the inconsolable, began to empty. Not because patients were healed, because they could no longer suffer in ways that disturbed the people watching them. The procedure was simple. It took perhaps 30 minutes. An orbitoclast, a thin ice pick-like instrument, was inserted above the eye socket. A tap of the hammer. The blade would transect the neural pathways connecting the prefrontal cortex to the rest of the brain. Done. The person would wake up. They would be different, calmer, emptier, like a photograph of themselves. The violent would become docile. The anxious would become indifferent. The depressed would become flat, not happy, not well, just gone. Families brought their relatives in, sons and daughters, wives and brothers, with hope in their hearts. They returned home with people who looked like their loved ones, but were no longer quite there. Something had been subtracted from the equation, and they told themselves this was medicine, this was progress. But there were whispers even then. A mother noticed her daughter no longer laughed. A wife observed that her husband had lost all ambition, all desire, all yearning. Patients who had been intelligent became simple. Those who had been artists could no longer dream. Personality, they discovered, lived in those severed connections. The irony, terrible and complete, was this. It worked. The patients were no longer a problem. They were no longer violent, no longer screaming, no longer forcing society to confront the messy, chaotic reality of human pain. They were fixed by being hollowed out, by having their complexity removed, by being turned into something more manageable, more controllable, more convenient. And perhaps that is the most unsettling part of this history. It worked so well precisely because it removed the things that made people uncomfortable, not for the patient, but for everyone else. Society was not anguished by the suffering of the mentally ill. Society was anguished by being forced to acknowledge it. So the solution was not to heal. The solution was to silence. It took decades before the procedure fell away. Not because doctors suddenly developed consciences, not because science advanced and offered better answers, but because the practice had become too visible, too undeniable. Too many families were standing in hospital corridors, looking at shells of people who had once been their children. Too many whispers had become too loud. Today, we do not perform transorbital lobotomies. We have moved beyond them. Or have we? We live in an age obsessed with optimization. with removing the parts of ourselves that cause discomfort, with medicalizing sadness, pathologizing doubt, medicating away uncertainty. We are offered solutions that promise to make the chaos of human experience more manageable, to streamline us, to make us more productive, more stable, more controllable. And we accept these solutions with the same hope that families once accepted lobotomies, with the same belief that if we could just remove the part that aches, the part that questions, the part that resists, we could finally be well. But the question that haunts us, the question that should haunt us, is this: what happens when we forget that the parts of us that are most difficult to live with are inseparable from the parts that make us worth knowing? That chooses fixing over feeling. Perhaps that is the real procedure, and we are only now beginning to wake up.